clear spot is here.
Whoa.
I see why it's most dangerous. It's slippery.
Hopefully by this point in time, you, if you weren't already, you're becoming more familiar with the appearance of maple trees. You do have a dark gray bark. Vertical furrows appear in it as the tree matures, and those furrows you see a reddish brown bark underneath. Oftentimes you'll see tiny little pea-sized holes drilled in the maple trees. Those holes are drilled by a relative of woodpeckers. Woodpeckers, when they drill holes, they'll drill large baseball-sized holes in trees. They're looking for insects, for larvae. These birds are relatives of woodpeckers, but they use a little different method. They drill small, pea-sized holes. Oftentimes you'll see them in a row, straight across maple trees. Pretty much any maple except for Norway maples. Norway maples is the one member of the maple family that we can't use to produce maple syrup. Norway maples, which are native to Europe, they're not indigenous to this country. They contain a latex in their sap. You break off a leaf of a Norway maple, and a milky fluid will ooze out. That's a latex. Makes it unfit for consumption. But any other tree, member of the maple family is fine for syrup other than that, including boxelders, which is a member of the maple family. They have a compound leaf, unlike other maples. Oftentimes you'll see these little holes. You may have heard the name of the bird that drills these holes, but you may not have even believed that this bird exists. The bird is a yellow-bellied sapsucker. You may have called this yellow-bellied sapsucker.
Do you know what they look like? The birds? Can you describe what they look like?
No, because I am not a
Do they really have a yellow belly, I wonder?
Ben could probably describe what yellow-bellied sapsuckers look like better than I. Ben's been going to our camps long enough. He's probably a better birder than I am. What do they look like? Yellow belly. You got a yellow belly, yeah.
I wonder if you're that was why I asked.
I'm not sure. Birds aren't my thing. Spiders I could probably name for you. Plants. Birds aren't my thing. But there are plenty of birders up there hanging around that lodge building. I'm sure they'll be more than happy to tell you all about yellow-bellied sapsucker. I do know, however, that unlike woodpeckers, they're looking for insects. They'll drill their holes in the maple trees, and then they leave. And they leave, and the sap begins to ooze out of those holes. Well, ourselves and yellow-bellied sapsuckers aren't the only things that like sticky sweet things. A lot of insects like sticky sweet things. So insects will fly, ants will crawl along to have a bite of that sap. Many of them become stuck there as they're eating. So when the yellow-bellied sapsucker returns to the holes it's drilled after having departed for a while, not only does it have a high carbohydrate meal in the sugars, the starches in the maple sap, it also has some protein in its diet from the insects that have become trapped there while eating the sap. So kind of an interesting adaptation in the animal world that goes on, kind of a neat thing. We'll move on down to some leather trout. They are the originators of that process. Europeans didn't have maple syrup. They didn't have sugar maples over there. If you were European before coming to this land and you wanted something sweet, you used honey. There were no honeybees here in North America. Honeybees came from Europe. They came over on the boats with the colonists. Native Americans called them English flies. They'd never seen honeybees before. But then they looked like the flies that they were used to. They knew they came over on the boats with the English, so they called them English flies. But they had been making maple syrup for thousands of years and taught that to the pioneers upon their arrival. The only thing that has changed in the thousands of years that this maple sugaring has been going on, man has been making syrup and sugar from maple sap, is the technology. The recipe is still the same. You take maple sap and you boil it and reduce it, in the case of sugar maple sap, about 40 times until it's condensed into your syrup. Right, the only thing that's changed is the technology available. Native Americans were in the Stone Age. They used wood and materials that occurred naturally, that were available in nature around them, stones to heat their sap. By the time the colonists arrived, the Europeans had developed their technology to the point that they were manufacturing metal items, but those metal items were very expensive to produce and to acquire. People would save a lot of money, a lifetime's worth of money for metal items. Wood, on the other hand, was everywhere. When the colonists got here, Pennsylvania and New York were entirely forested with 160-foot-tall white pine trees. Right, every single bit of space. So wood was freely available. By the 1900s, by the turn of the last century, when the land that we're standing on was a working farm, and Mr. Oglebay would bring his family here from Cleveland to escape from the hustle and bustle of the city. He was bringing in agriculturalists, the world's top agriculturalists at the time, to work on new methods of farming. In 1900, when he was collecting sap to make his syrup, this was the technology that was available at the time. By that point in time, metal was more freely available. So because it was easier to keep clean and more durable, metal was more often used. The spiles by this time were made out of metal, no more whittling down sumac to make your spiles. The buckets were metal as well. These buckets in particular were patented in 1904 by Wheeling-Pittsburgh Steel. So this is exactly the technology that was available during this time period. In order to have a maple tree, it should be at least 10 inches in diameter. Any smaller than that, and you risk drilling through the xylem into the heartwood, which is part of the tree that in the center that gives its strength, its structure, its support. You risk killing the tree. Alright, so 10 inches in diameter. Whenever you measure a tree, you measure 4.5 feet off the ground. 4.5 feet off the ground must be 10 inches in diameter. Now you notice I'm speaking in inches and feet. Those of you familiar with science know that internationally, the standard for measurement in science is the metric system, except for forestry. For some reason or other, forestry is the one branch of science that still uses the imperial method. They still measure in feet, inches, miles, acres. I don't know why. Other than they've been doing it a long time. Somebody earlier said stubborn. I guess that could be it. But everybody switched except for forestry.
Is that worldwide?
Yes.
So like foresters in Europe
Yep.
still use that system too? Is it too hard to convert an acre into something?
I don't know acres, probably. Not with Google.
What would you convert an acre into? If you had to convert it into something like that?
Square kilometers.
Okay.
10 inches in diameter. If a tree is 16 inches in diameter, 4.5 feet off the ground, you can place 2 taps into that tree. Later on, you'll see some of our trees have multiple traps. 24 inches, you can put 3 taps in the tree. 32 inches, you can put 4 taps in the tree. Sugar maples don't get much larger than 32 inches. About 30 inches diameter, 120 feet tall, is about as large as sugar maples grow. I've never heard of more than 4 taps being placed into a single tree. But that's the standard. If you follow that, then you can tap your tree yearly. Same tree without typically causing any problems. Drill 3 to 4 inches into your tree. Once again, deeper than that, you risk drilling through the xylem. 3 to 4 inches, though, is enough to get you into the sapwood to allow for good sap flow. What it was is originally the standards for a number of taps in a tree was every 8 inches. 8, 16, 24, 32. They decided that 8 inches was a little small. They were losing some trees, so they increased that lowest diameter to 10 inches. So rather than 8, 16, now 10, 16, 24, 32. So that's why it's set up as such. So by this time they had metal spiles by the 1900s. This bucket systems were produced specifically for maple sap collection. It's called a spile driver, as the name implies. It's what you use to drive your spile into the tree. A few taps into your hole. Buckets have a nice little hole from which to hang them on your spile. Then the last step in the whole process is you take your lid, wire in the lid runs through a hole in the spile and keeps the lid on the bucket.